Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's deep dive.
Mhm.
We're really thrilled to have you here.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you are someone who looks at the overwhelming, just mile-a-minute daily news cycle and thinks, I just need someone to connect the dots for me, well, you are in the perfect place.
You really are.
Today, our mission is to cut through all that relentless noise. We are going to map out the massive, decades-long geopolitical chessboard involving the United States, Israel, and Iran.
It is a massive board, too.
It really is. And to do this, we've pulled together an incredibly dense stack of sources. I mean, we are synthesizing extensive reports from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Network for Strategic Analysis, the Soufan Center.
The Atlantic Council as well.
Right, the Atlantic Council, plus some really compelling data visualizations from visual capitalists and a foundational geographical explainer to just ground us in the map.
Which is so important.
It is. But before we dive in, we need to be crystal clear. The sources we are unpacking today contain highly sensitive, politically charged geopolitical conflicts. We want to state upfront that we are never taking any sides here.
Never.
We are impartially reporting on the content provided to convey the ideas in the original source material. We are not endorsing any viewpoints, just helping you understand the facts and perspectives exactly as they were presented in the texts.
Exactly. And to truly grasp the gravity of the explosive events and the future scenarios we're analyzing today, looking at surface-level headlines simply will not work.
No, it won't.
We have to examine the slow-moving tectonic plates of geography and history. You cannot understand the current friction without understanding the actual ground it is built upon.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the map itself. When you look at our geographical explainer, Iran's position isn't just a location, it's really a fortress.
A literal fortress.
Right, it's wedged right between the Caspian Sea to the north and the Persian Gulf to the south, surrounded by these imposing mountain ranges. It acts as a massive land bridge.
Yeah, and it shares incredibly complex borders with Iraq, Turkey, Afghanistan, and Pakistan.
Which dictates why a conventional ground invasion is a complete logistical nightmare, right? That perfectly explains their reliance on asymmetric warfare.
And historically, I mean, the relationship between the U.S. and Iran wasn't always characterized by this intense standoff.
No, not at all. If we look back to the period before the late 1970s, during the era of the Iranian monarchy, the U.S. and Iran operated with relatively cooperative relations.
Right, they were allies.
They collaborated on trade, security, regional stability. The Iranian Revolution in the late 1970s marked a profound historical pivot. It completely shattered that trust.
Replaced it with decades of indirect communication, deep suspicion, and just layers upon layers of complex economic sanctions.
Which brings us to a fundamental question. Why does Iran operate the way it does on the global stage today? Our source from the Soufan Center lays out their underlying motivation beautifully.
They really do.
They define Iran's grand strategy as the pursuit of absolute security.
Absolute security. Basically, their ultimate goal is to thwart any attempt by the United States, Israel, or any regional rivals to overturn their regime or invade their territory.
Right.
Every foreign policy decision, every military maneuver is viewed entirely through the lens of regime survival.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is that Iranian leadership operates with a very clear-eyed assessment of their own military capabilities. They know they cannot win a conventional head-to-head military war against superpowers like the United States.
Or highly capable, technologically advanced militaries like Israel's.
Right. They lack the conventional hardware, the air superiority, and the naval fleets to match them. Because they cannot win a symmetric war, they adopted an entirely different strategy to survive.
Asymmetric warfare.
Exactly. They shifted their focus entirely to asymmetric warfare.
I was reading the Soufan Center report, and their explanation of Iran's playbook is captivating because they can't match their adversaries tank for tank or jet for jet. Iran leverages its elite military branch, the Quds Force, which is part of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC.
Yeah.
Essentially, what the Quds Force does is build clones of itself all across the Middle East. Instead of deploying traditional armies, they just franchise their military model.
It is a highly sophisticated, multi-decade strategy of proxy warfare. The Quds Force identifies, recruits, trains, and heavily funds non-state actors.
They build them up from fragmented militant groups into massive, institutionalized political and military forces.
And Tehran refers to this interconnected network as the axis of resistance. The most mature and successful realization of this entire process is in Lebanon, with Hezbollah.
The scale of that specific relationship is staggering. I mean, the Soufan Center notes that Hezbollah essentially started with Iranian backing after the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Fast forward to today, and they are a political kingmaker within the Lebanese state. The data from the sources indicates that the U.S. Treasury Department estimated back in 2018 that Iran was providing Hezbollah with around $700 million a year.
$700 million.
But how do you even move that much money and a massive arsenal of over 100,000 rockets into Lebanon?
Well, funding and arming a proxy of that size requires an incredibly complex, multimodal smuggling network. It involves moving hardware and cash through land corridors via Iraq and Syria.
Using shell companies too, right?
Yeah, shell companies, and leveraging black market financial networks to bypass international monitors. And the franchise model doesn't stop at the Lebanese border.
No, it doesn't.
In Iraq, the IRGC Quds Force helped build and consolidate several Shia militias, often referred to as the Popular Mobilization Units, or PMUs. Groups like Kataib Hezbollah fall under this umbrella.
I notice in the text that these Iraqi groups were armed by Iran with highly specific, deadly weaponry, particularly explosively formed penetrators, or EFPs.
EFPs.
For those of us who aren't military engineers, what exactly makes an EFP so devastating compared to a standard explosive device?
An EFP is essentially a highly advanced shaped charge. Instead of an explosion expanding outward in all directions.
Like a normal bomb.
Exactly. The explosive force of an EFP molds a concave metal disc, usually made of copper, into a high-velocity, molten aerodynamic slug.
Wow.
This slug travels at staggering speeds with such concentrated kinetic energy that it can punch straight through the heavy reinforced armor of a tank or a Humvee.
That's terrifying.
These weapons were historically devastating to U.S. armor during the Iraq War, and supplying them was a clear demonstration of Iran transferring advanced asymmetric capabilities to its proxies.
Then you pan the map down to Yemen, where Iran saw an opportunity to support the Houthi rebels. Geographically, the Houthis are positioned right at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait,
Which is one of the world's most critical maritime shipping choke points.
But the part of the Soufan Center's analysis that really stopped me in my tracks was the distant recruits. For the conflict in Syria, Iran didn't just send its own commanders.
No, they didn't.
They recruited tens of thousands of undocumented Afghan and Pakistani migrants living inside Iran, forming the Fatimiyun and Zainabiyun divisions, and sent them into the Syrian meat grinder to prop up the Syrian regime.
Yeah.
How do you motivate thousands of undocumented migrants to fight a proxy war in a foreign country?
The logistics of that recruitment drive reveal a lot about the Quds Force's operational flexibility.
Yeah.
They targeted a highly vulnerable population.
Right.
By offering salaries, legal residency, and promises of citizenship for their families in exchange for military service, they effectively built an entirely new, expendable proxy army from scratch.
Unbelievable.
All of this continuous proxy building feeds directly into what the Network for Strategic Analysis report describes as the shadow war. For decades, Israel and Iran have been locked in a high-stakes gray zone conflict.
A gray zone, meaning a war fought deliberately below the threshold of an all-out conventional war, allowing both sides to maintain plausible deniability. It is like a deadly staring contest in the dark.
That's a great way to put it. This shadow war involved highly sophisticated cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, targeted assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists,
Israel striking Iranian weapons convoys and influence networks in Syria.
and Iran utilizing its proxies to constantly harass Israel and U.S. forces in the region. It was a carefully calibrated dance of violence. Both sides understood the unwritten rules of engagement.
Right. They kept the temperature just simmering enough to achieve strategic goals while avoiding a massive regional conflagration.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because that carefully calibrated dance completely fell apart.
It absolutely did.
The Network for Strategic Analysis report maps out exactly how this shadow war violently broke out into the open, pointing to a massive escalation in April 2024.
April 2024.
After an Israeli strike on an Iranian diplomatic compound in Damascus, which killed several high-ranking Iranian commanders, Iran decided the unwritten rules no longer applied. They felt they had to respond directly.
The nature of that Iranian response was entirely unprecedented. For the first time in 45 years, Iran discarded its cardinal rule of indirect proxy warfare.
Yeah.
On the night of April 13 to 14, 2024, they launched a massive barrage consisting of 170 drones and 120 ballistic missiles directly from Iranian soil into Israeli territory.
170 drones and 120 missiles. The logistics of coordinating that, crossing multiple sovereign airspaces simultaneously, is just wild to think about. It was a clear, undeniable shift in posture.
Completely.
But the Israeli response detailed in the report was equally calculated. Israel fired missiles at an airbase in Isfahan. Now, Isfahan is incredibly important because it is the facility responsible for protecting Natanz, one of Iran's most sensitive, deeply buried nuclear sites.
Right.
The analysis suggests Israel's goal wasn't to level the facility and start World War III. It was to prove a very specific point.
The Israeli strike was a demonstration of penetration capability. They wanted to show the Iranian leadership that Israeli assets could penetrate deep into Iranian airspace, entirely bypass Iran's advanced air defense systems.
And strike with precision right at the doorstep of their nuclear program.
Exactly, all without Iran being able to intercept the attack.
And after that unbelievable direct exchange of fire silence, both sides essentially put their shadow warrior masks back on and retreated to their corners.
They did.
But the sources we are looking at don't stop their analysis at 2024. The Carnegie Endowment report does something absolutely fascinating here. They project these current tensions forward.
Yeah, they map out a highly detailed hypothetical war game scenario for early 2026, exploring what a full-blown, open-ended war would actually look like.
Scenario planning like this is an essential tool for think tanks and military strategists, right?
Yeah.
To understand the ultimate stakes of a conflict.
It is. The Carnegie forecast envisions a situation beginning on February 28, 2026, where the U.S. and Israel launch a coordinated, massive military campaign against Iran.
And the objectives outlined in this hypothetical 2026 operation are staggering. The reported goals of this scenario are essentially to impose unconditional surrender on Tehran.
Total surrender.
The scenario details the complete elimination of Iran's nuclear program, a radical curtailment of its ballistic missile capacities, and the systematic dismantling of its entire regional proxy network.
And the most shocking part of the Carnegie war game is the parallel objective of regime change.
Right.
Which is reportedly accelerated in their scenario by the killing of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. You would assume that the sudden death of the supreme leader in the middle of an overwhelming war would cause the entire regime to instantly crumble into chaos.
Yeah, that would be the logical assumption.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the reality presented in the Carnegie analysis is quite counterintuitive. The war game suggests that Khamenei's death during this wartime scenario might have ironically bolstered the Iranian regime's continuity.
I had to read that section twice. How does losing your head of state during a war actually strengthen the regime's grip on power?
Any transition of power after Khamenei's death, from natural causes during peacetime, was always going to be highly volatile for a regime that has historically struggled with popular legitimacy.
Right, sure.
A peacetime transition could easily spark massive, uncontrollable civilian protests. However, because this hypothetical changeover happens in the midst of an open-ended existential war with foreign powers,
the civilian population is simply not in a position to mobilize.
Exactly. The state of emergency allows Iran's vast security apparatus to lock down the country, enforce martial law, and consolidate power without dealing with internal civilian interference.
That is a fascinating unintended consequence of the war game scenario. But while the regime might survive internally in this 2026 forecast, their grand proxy strategy, that carefully constructed axis of resistance, completely fractures.
It falls apart.
The Carnegie report details the failure of Iran's unity of the arena strategy. The core idea of this doctrine was that if one member of the axis was attacked, they would all seamlessly rise up and fight together to overwhelm the enemy.
But by the simulated timeline of 2026, the reality on the ground prevents that unity. Hamas is modeled as entirely exhausted and degraded by years of continuous war in Gaza.
The pro-Iran militias in Iraq are marginalized, capable of little more than marginal harassment of U.S. bases.
And the Houthis in Yemen are geographically too isolated to do more than apply indirect maritime pressure. The burden of the unity of the arena strategy falls almost entirely on Hezbollah in Lebanon.
And according to the forecast, Hezbollah makes a catastrophic strategic miscalculation. The Carnegie piece details how, on March 3, 2026, Hezbollah fired a handful of short-range rockets into northern Israel. The report describes it as a pinprick attack.
A pinprick?
If Hezbollah has this massive arsenal of 100,000 advanced rockets, why would they choose to open hostilities with a minor, ineffectual strike? That seems like an incredibly poor choice.
It represents a bizarre strategic paralysis. The analysis suggests Hezbollah might have been attempting to show solidarity with Tehran without inviting full-scale destruction upon themselves.
Trying to thread an impossible needle.
Precisely. But the result of that miscalculation is anything but minor. The Israeli response modeled in the scenario is absolutely devastating, unleashing the full weight of their air force against Hezbollah's infrastructure.
The hypothetical fallout is utterly grim. The scenario outlines Israelis bombing Beirut's southern suburbs, towns across the south, and the Bekaa Valley. It results in the immediate evacuation of 53 villages.
53 villages.
The casualty toll on the very first morning is projected at 31 dead and 149 injured, rapidly escalating into a massive humanitarian crisis that displaces hundreds of thousands of Lebanese Shiites.
And the political fallout for Hezbollah within Lebanon is projected to be just as severe as the military degradation. The Lebanese government, recognizing the existential threat this war poses to their already fragile state, takes the unprecedented step of formally outlying Hezbollah's military activities.
Even traditional political allies of Hezbollah within the Lebanese parliament turn against them.
In the war game, Hezbollah finds itself geographically battered and politically trapped, entirely isolated within a multi-sectarian system that universally blames them for the catastrophic destruction of the country.
So what does this all mean? We've talked extensively about grand strategy, the logistics of proxy militias, and hypothetical regime survival scenarios. But if you are sitting in Tokyo, London, or New York right now listening to this, why should you care about this specific geopolitical chess match? Well, it all comes back to the map and directly to your wallet.
This is where the economic data from Visual Capitalist is absolutely crucial for understanding the global stakes. The focal point shifts entirely to the Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz is this incredibly narrow waterway position between Iran and Oman. At its absolute narrowest point, it is only 21 miles wide.
Just 21 miles.
But according to the Visual Capitalist data, roughly 100 massive cargo-carrying vessels pass through that tiny gap every single day.
And the cargo those vessels carry is the lifeblood of the global economy. About 20% of the entire world's crude oil consumption flows through that 21-mile strait.
20%.
Furthermore, 20% of the global liquefied natural gas, or LNG, travels through there as well. It acts as the primary jugular vein of the global energy market.
And the region that is most heavily exposed to this vulnerability is Asia. The data shows that 89% of the crude oil and condensate passing through the strait goes straight to Asian markets. Just to clarify the terminology for a moment, condensate is essentially a very light, highly volatile liquid form of petroleum that is incredibly valuable for petrochemical production. And there is one specific buyer that completely dominates Iran's oil exports: China.
The numbers detailing the China-Iran energy relationship are striking. Visual Capitalist highlights that China purchases roughly 91% of Iran's total oil exports.
Wow.
In 2024, that trade amounted to $32.5 billion. China is able to buy this massive volume of oil at a steep negotiated discount, saving billions of dollars.
And they can dictate these terms precisely because they are one of the few global powers willing to bypass the complex web of Western sanctions that have effectively scared off almost every other international buyer.
Exactly. This massive revenue stream provides Iran with an economic lifeline, which explains how they can afford to continue funding Hezbollah and the PMUs despite being cut off from Western markets.
So when we look back at the Carnegie Report's war game scenario of the 2026 conflict, Iran's retaliation strategy suddenly makes perfect, terrifying sense.
It really does.
Facing an overwhelming conventional military assault from the U.S. and Israel, Iran doesn't just fire missiles back at military bases. They target the foundation of the global economy.
The forecast notes that Iran's ultimate asymmetric response involves attempting to completely close the Strait of Hormuz while simultaneously systematically bombing the oil production and export infrastructure of neighboring Arab countries.
Unbelievable.
By choking off 20% of the world's energy supply, Iran attempts to hold the entire global economy hostage. Their strategic calculation is that the ensuing global financial panic, the collapse of supply chains, and skyrocketing energy prices would force the international community to pressure the U.S. and Israel to back down and negotiate a ceasefire.
It is the ultimate form of asymmetric leverage. But while we are analyzing billions of dollars, grand geopolitical maneuvers, and think tank war games, we also have to remember the very real human toll on the ground.
We do.
The Atlantic Council report we reviewed brings a highly sobering present-day perspective to this. They look deeply at the humanitarian impact of U.S. secondary sanctions on Iran leading up to these conflicts. We should probably quickly define secondary sanctions.
Good idea.
Primary sanctions mean U.S. companies cannot do business with Iran. Secondary sanctions mean the U.S. government is telling foreign banks and international companies, if you choose to do business with Iran, you cannot do business in the United States or utilize the U.S. financial system.
Understanding that mechanism is a critical piece of the puzzle. On paper, U.S. secondary sanctions explicitly contain exemptions for humanitarian trade, specifically allowing for the flow of food, agricultural commodities, and life-saving medicine.
On paper.
Right, on paper. However, the Atlantic Council analysis shows that the broad, aggressive nature of the sanctions, particularly their enforcement on the global banking system, creates a massive chilling effect.
Global banks, shipping insurers, and pharmaceutical companies are so terrified of accidentally violating a complex U.S. sanction and facing massive, crippling financial penalties that they simply choose to overcomply.
They decide the legal risk just isn't worth the profit, so they refuse to process any transactions or do any business with Iran at all, even for totally legal, heavily exempted humanitarian goods.
And the direct result of that corporate overcompliance is that everyday Iranian citizens, people who have absolute nothing to do with the IRGC, the Quds Force, or the regional proxy wars, are effectively blocked from accessing life-saving healthcare, specialized medical equipment, and essential medicine.
It is a stark reminder that in these massive geopolitical standoffs between states, it is almost always the civilian populations who are forced to bear the quiet everyday costs. The decisions made in fortified war rooms and gleaming financial capitals ripple outward across the globe, affecting millions of lives in very tangible, immediate ways. It impacts everything from the cost of heating a home in Europe during the winter to the availability of vital chemotherapy drugs in a hospital in Tehran.
It is all incredibly deeply interconnected. So, to briefly recap the expansive journey we've just been on, we started by analyzing a quiet, decades-long historical shadow war fought deliberately in the gray zone.
Then we explore the logistics of Iran's masterclass in franchise warfare, building a vast network of proxy militias across the Middle East to ensure its own absolute security.
We saw how that fragile tension violently erupted into the unprecedented direct military missile exchanges of 2024. And finally, we explored the think tank forecasts of 2026, a hypothetical, massive, open-ended war that threatens to completely choke off a fifth of the world's energy supply and hold the global economy hostage.
This raises an important question. For over a century, global geopolitical power has been largely dictated by who controls physical, geographic choke points.
Right, like the Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, and the Strait of Malacca.
Exactly. But as nations across the globe watch their entire economies remain perpetually vulnerable to being held hostage by a 21-mile stretch of water in an active war zone, it forces a profound strategic reckoning.
Yeah.
Will this ultimate, undeniable geopolitical vulnerability be the final catalyst that forces the world to rapidly accelerate the transition to renewable energy infrastructure? Not necessarily out of a primary concern for the climate, but purely as a matter of hard, localized national security.
Because if a nation can generate its power domestically from the sun and the wind, its economy can no longer be held hostage by a distant, blockaded strait.
Precisely.
Wow. Viewing the global energy transition through the strict lens of military and economic national security rather than just environmental policy is a completely different way to look at the future, and definitely something profound to chew on.
It really is.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It is a dense, heavy topic, but understanding the intricate mechanisms and strategies operating beneath the daily headlines is the absolute best way to stay genuinely informed and not overwhelmed. Keep questioning what you read, keep looking for the bigger picture, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.